Chinese Pacific Militarization, a Digital Video Policy Memorandum by Allison Bitner, Daniel Teti, and Alice Greider. With the rise of China's economic and military capability, there are growing concerns among policymakers in the U.S. as well as other nations in the Asian-Pacific region. According to Fu Ying, spokeswoman for the People's Congress, the Chinese government will increase its military budget by 10% in 2015, with similar yearly increases projected for the near future. Additionally, the Chinese government has made significant advances on key strategic targets in order to bolster their regional influence. The Chinese government is making numerous long-term investments in the island nations in the Pacific. This makes many of the traditional trading partners like Australia and Japan uneasy about the shifting power relations in the Asian-Pacific region. This memorandum provides a brief synopsis of the rising tensions, including the increase of Chinese influence and its implications for the U.S. and her regional allies, followed by an analysis of the current bilateral relationship between China and the U.S. Subsequently, we will set forth two key recommendations for U.S. policymakers to consider. First, we recommend that U.S. policymakers prioritize the Asian-Pacific region militarily by bolstering and maintaining our strategic presence and influence in key locations throughout the region. Second, we recommend renewed efforts to include Chinese policymakers in international security efforts and encourage diplomatic partnership among the Asian-Pacific nations. By combining the efforts of asserting the preservation of both U.S. military and economic interest and strengthening partnerships with the Chinese government, we will ensure positive rearrangement of the security architecture of the region and keep it free from military aggression and economic monopolization.
The ruling party of China is the Communists, founded in 1921 with now over 58 million members. The Communists require its members to be self-disciplined and have the ability to make personal sacrifices and to set a good example for the masses in production, work, study, and social lives. There are many reasons for China's recent military buildup. China's growing military power is to equal that of the United States because of the increase in our presence in the region of Asia. China also wants to be able to defend itself against foreign aggression and catch up with the West. China is also building its military to protect its economic position in Asia and its trade connections to the resources in Southeast Asia. These resources include coal and oil. Chinese money is pouring into infrastructure and construction projects across the South Pacific. Many of the island nations that have borrowed are hoping that China might one day agree to forgive the debt. These repayments are now falling due and budget deficits are growing. Because of this, China is gaining leverage and influence in the area, giving them an advantage. Some of the maritime laws between East Asian countries include international maritime law, restrictions on any ships from passing within 12 nautical miles of the shoreline of any country, and spy planes being restricted from coming within 200 to 350 nautical miles of the shoreline of any country. China is also developing anti-access aerial denial plans that would limit the ability of the U.S. Navy to operate freely near China's coast. China and the U.S.'s relationship has been stable with minor conflict during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. China and the United States have mutual political, economic, and security interests, including the prevention of terrorism.
Therefore, in the face of China's militarization, and given its history and background, we recommend a twofold policy of rebalancing the U.S. defensive position in the Pacific and encouraging Beijing towards a more cooperative security posture to both prepare for and prevent further conflict. Although there are different approaches to further militarization, we'd recommend this in preference to other arguments, such as the realist argument, which would call for an equal reactionary buildup of our own Pacific forces. Analysts note that although China is apt to seize opportunities and challenge the international system, the Chinese would likely not want war. War with the West for China would likely cripple their trade revenues and GDP, and they would likely be overwhelmed by other Asian allies of the U.S., such as Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Our policy recommendation then consists of two steps, the first one being a rebalancing of the U.S. defensive positioning in the Pacific. Given the Obama administration's half-hearted pivot towards Asia, we would actually recommend rebalancing to include China, along with the Pacific Rim states and other states in the area. ASEAN, the Trans-Pacific Partnership with smaller Asian states, and other deals with other Pacific states actually exclude and alienate China, with whom the U.S. should be developing tighter relations. Furthermore, we should continue the existing efforts to cooperate defensively with China. Already, the U.S. and China have recently brokered deals to cooperate over matters of nuclear security, particularly pertinent given North Korea's nuclear terrorism threat to the region, and agreed upon steps to combat climate change. As Flint notes in his Introduction to Geopolitics, discussions of area access denial would point to China as a potential challenger to U.S. world leadership. On the other hand, the move towards nuclear security cooperation suggests partnership that could develop into the coalition building and further cooperation that is a key step into dissuading China from becoming a challenger to the U.S. position as world leader, according to Modeleski's model, which identifies historical cycles in world leadership. President Obama has called these security deals part of the healthy competition between the U.S. and China. This is precisely why we do not see military escalation as the most appropriate course of action. The U.S. does need to remain a Pacific power. The focus on the Middle East and preoccupation with the conflict there has left the U.S.'s Pacific bases and alliance networks vulnerable. As outlined in the U.S. Defense Department's Global Posture Review, the U.S. should now seek to take advantage of emerging allies and security partners, as well as restructure and strengthen existing bases in strategic locations such as Guam, Midway Island, Australia, Singapore, Hawaii, and Alaska. Although there is an improbable fear of Chinese aggression towards the United States, the U.S. should still be concerned about China using its increased military to threaten and bully others in the region, some of whom are U.S. allies. According to the China Daily, President Xi has already issued a warning to Taiwanese independence seekers, saying they threaten national sovereignty, the first time such an open statement has been made by Mr. Xi. China may also threaten smaller states and nations in the area, such as Tibet and the Philippines, although nowhere in its government white papers would such a policy be found. The Washington Times reports that the Philippines has already purchased 2 naval ships from the U.S. to boost their maritime protection from China. Therefore, a rebalanced U.S. position in the area seems to be welcomed by potential targets of Chinese aggressiveness. Secondly, as a more diplomatic step to accompany the military precautions, we recommend encouraging Beijing towards greater international involvement and integration. Instead of being a security concern, the aim should be for China to become a security participant. The U.S. and the West should make efforts to encourage Beijing to become more involved in international bodies, treaties, and cooperative security measures. If China grows to see itself as the Asian version of the United States, a safeguard of disputes and international quarrels, then the U.S. need not be concerned with Chinese aggression and drastically growing its Pacific presence as much.
It is our consistent position that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter form the cornerstone of current international relations and provide safeguards for world peace and stability.
The current policy of supporting other Asian nations only alienates China, drawing them away from the international scene. Instead, the U.S. should work to establish positive relations with China and other Asian nations to draw China into more international security agreements. Although this may mean lessening commitments with other Asian nations to policies that China does not support, such as Tibetan autonomy, Chinese claims to South China Sea territory, maritime supremacy, and Taiwanese independence, and most importantly, rivalry with U.S.-supported Japan. The U.S. should consider its future positions on these issues with respect to relations with and encouragement of China, particularly given the existence of large military bases in Japan itself. If we do not make and encourage these changes to the security architecture of the Asian Pacific, then U.S. inaction may be mistaken for negligence of not only the U.S. commitment to non-aggression and peace, but also to U.S. allies in the region. U.S. presence alone is a deterrent enough to avoid conflict. It is enough the Asian network of bases be supported and grown. Maintaining a stabilizing force in the region, particularly against rogue states like North Korea, is likely to be difficult without the proper capabilities. It is also likely that China will seek to fill the gap left by U.S. negligence. As mentioned above, although the Chinese do not usually seek war, they are actively looking to expand where opportunities allow them to. It is that expansion that the U.S. must guide and keep watch over in order to respond strategically to Chinese militarization in the Pacific.
Although China's rapidly growing global and regional influence is unsettling to many, it is necessary for the United States to compete with China militarily and economically without causing undue tensions to arise. China has experienced several consecutive years over 10% increase in military spending, and their budget for 2015 does not look any different. Despite China's military increases and economic opportunism, U.S. policymakers must not overlook the fact that China's international security goals are shared by the United States. Economic and political influence can only be obtained by increased security regionally and globally. Trade, power, and security are all essential to the success of both nations.